So we went grocery shopping today, and that's my grocery list. So, it was stuck to the bottom of this.
Yeah.
So I thought I may as well show you what we bought. So
Yeah.
exciting.
So-
Grocery shopping is the most exciting part of my life. So it's, James is going to be talking about music as a mirror of history.
Yeah,
It's a
so
great course,
this
and it is awesome.
It's a great course.
Yes.
The music is better than the history.
And the instruction is very entertaining.
The music instruction.
Professor Robert Greenberg.
Oh, the instructor. Yeah, he's an entertaining
Well, yeah.
guy. He does, it's almost like dance, you know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? He's dancing from the waist on up, but maybe that's all for the better. He's a cute little fella and stuff like that. The problem with the history is he's just going more or less with accepted wisdom. And the trouble is with a lot of history, accepted wisdom is on wisdom. It's not that bright. But, it's important to know what people are saying, even when it's intellectual dishonesty. I'm not saying he's being intellectually dishonest. He's using sometimes fairly standard sorts of sources for these things. So we already dealt a little bit with it. I had a little bit of trouble with his analysis of what was happening with the Turks, and it was the abduction from the harem done by Mozart. That first performed 1781 or 1782. Here it says 1782. And like he's talking basically about Mozart, although thank heavens he doesn't use the term othering Turks and stuff like that. And he's saying, the Turks and the Europeans were fighting back and forth. No, it wasn't. It was forth, not back, for the Turks. The stuff was happening in Europe, and Turks have no business being in Europe. The fact is, they don't have any business being in Turkey. If we're looking at things strictly speaking, where they come from is Siberia, and if you look at it really carefully, you'll find out that they probably belong on the shores of the Arctic Ocean up in Siberia, northeastern Siberia. That having been said, now that they're in Turkey, they should be allowed to stay there and all that sort of stuff. But it should be pointed out when they're telling Jews to get back where they came from, the Jews are actually where they came from, and the Turks are being hypocrites there. They'd better mind their P's and Q's when they're heading elsewhere. For example, in Europe, there are quite a few Turks that are misbehaving themselves in Europe, and you've got people declaring a caliphate state, for example, in Hamburg. This is about 20 years ago, and that's in a place where they have no historical background. Being a caliphate state, they were declaring independence in Hamburg. Wow, that's brilliant. When the Jews wanted to create an independent territory in starting about 1895 or something like that, maybe a little earlier with Theodor Herzl, there were pogroms against them when they headed to the Middle East. And that's shameful. I'm not encouraging any Germans to do any pogroms against anyone, or anyone doing any pogroms against anyone else. But what I'm saying is Turks should be trying to get their co-nationals to actually behave themselves when they're in other countries. It should be up to them basically to kind of tell them,
My tea went
Cool it.
cold. I should
Cool
have
it.
drank I'm drinking the last of my chamomile lavender tea, which is yum. And I heard yet last night on the discourse that he was talking about Russia. I'm sure you're going to talk a lot
there's a
about
lot
Russia.
of stuff about Russia here. So, there aren't necessarily the expected suspects, the usual suspects. Handel you expect, Mozart you expect, Haydn you expect, Beethoven you expect. There were two lectures on Beethoven. Berlioz, not necessarily. Chopin, you'd expect. Glinka, not really. So there's Russian, right? Strauss, Senior, I don't know. I'm not a big fan of this Strauss Senior or Junior, but I prefer Richard Strauss. Brahms, you expect. Gottschalk, well, that's a different one. Verdi, you expect. Wagner, you expect. Dvorak, you probably expect. Balakirev, no, you don't really expect him. So that was, again, that's a Russian. He said Janacek, but I think you said Janacek, or Jan Czech. Something like that. I believe he was a Moravian, which is basically Czech nowadays. Rimsky-Korsakov, you wouldn't necessarily expect, right? Holst, you wouldn't necessarily expect. Alban Berg, you wouldn't necessarily expect. Shostakovich, you wouldn't necessarily expect. Copland, you wouldn't necessarily expect. Gorecki, you wouldn't necessarily expect. Hold on, he's Polish, I think. Gorecki.
I really like the stuff he was talking about. I think it was way back at the beginning. Maybe he was a secondist. I'm not sure. But he was talking about Poland, and I think what he said was it's more of a state of mind than a state.
Well, that's the way it was.
And it's really interesting.
Yeah, the history of it over recent times has basically been being divided up between Prussia, which is kind of like Eastern Germany. And, well, it doesn't exist anymore because the Russians took it over and they never gave it back. They gave some of it to Poland. Yeah, this is one for left-wingers, you know, like I say. I think something accommodation should be made for the 750,000 Palestinians who, and this is according to an Egyptian general who were told to vacate by the Egyptian and the Arab troops in 1948. You know, so most of them weren't ethnic cleansed. There were some ethnic cleansing, I'm pretty sure, by the Jews in 1948, but the majority of them just got out on the instructions of their rather. They thought it was going to be a walkover, and they thought they were really going to wipe out the Jews back in 1947. There was 6 different countries fighting the Jews, including England. You never hear about that, but 5 Arabic countries in England fighting on the side of the Arabs, and they weren't fighting offensively; they were fighting defensively. But 6 different countries fighting against the Jews, 10 times as many personnel, 10 times as many tanks, 10 times as many guns, 10 times as much ammo, 10 times the number of planes, and they still got their hindquarters handed to them. So some sort of accommodation should be made, and it should actually be made by neighboring Arab countries. You know, they don't have a Palestinians don't. They have a historic claim. I study ancient history. They have a historic claim to the Gaza Strip. That's where the Assyrians locate them way back when. That's where the Egyptians locate them way back when. And you know, it would be a bigger Gaza Strip than it is now. You know, like for example, Tel Mikne, Ekron, the ancient city of Philistine or Palestinian city of Ekron is that's where Beelzebub came from. The Lord of the Flies came from, if I'm not mistaken. It's in Israel right now, and it shouldn't be. It should be part of the Gaza Strip. But the West Bank should actually be part of Israel. That's just the way it goes. We've got the historical, they're not really documents, records. They're Assyrian records, and the natives of that area are Jews and/or Muslims. So it's just the way it goes. You know, like we can make up history and all that sort of stuff. It's just. But what was he talking about? Yeah, his take on, yeah, well, we go with Crump, Black Angels, and he's talking about the Vietnamese War, and the war in Vietnam, as the way it's usually put, and he was saying, oh, the Americans didn't really have a plan, they lost that war. Well, you know, really, that was a small skirmish, fairly large actually, but it was a skirmish and it lasted a long time, in a war that was called the Cold War. And the Americans had to retreat in that skirmish. But, you know, I think the Americans actually kept a fairly good perspective on what was happening, which was about the Cold War. And they went, who won the Cold War? Do we have to do a review? What was that?
I don't know if anyone did.
Oh, it's the Russians lost it, and the Americans won it. Yeah.
I think it's still going.
Well, it got revived. The Americans had a very bad economic plan, so did the Russians in the 1990s, and it ended up being communists, only worse. Putin's worse than the communists. He basically has a communist totalitarian system, but now it's with Russian Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox religion. So it's not even secular. So it's pretty bad. In some ways, it's worse than communism under Brezhnev. And it remains to be seen how inefficient it's going to be. I suspect economically it's going to underperform once the Russians run out of oil. They won't have much going for them. Sad to say, because the Russians I've run across, I've liked quite a lot. But Putin is kind of running things there, and it won't be for the better. At any rate, the people who actually lost the Vietnamese War were the Vietnamese. They suffered a lot of casualties, and the Americans only had about 58,000 casualties. It looks as though the Vietnamese lost, almost 1.5 million troops and stuff like that. So it's a casualty rate of about 25 to 1, and stuff like that. The Vietnam was being used as a battlefield between communists, Chinese, and the Russians and the Americans. And the communists had no business being in the South. There had been independence and from France, and it was divided into two. And I can pretty well guarantee that if...
Yeah, it's pretty sad for the Vietnamese.
Yeah, exactly right. It should have stayed that way. It should have stayed divided. The way Korea was. And then you could see which system works better. So you look in Korea, North and South Korea, and you'll find out that per capita GDP in South Korea is about $19,000 a year. So if we had that kind of GDP coming in for us, we'd be twice as rich as we were over the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah,
really.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, so, we were making do on something like 18, yeah. To go to the food bank, but 18,000 a year. That's between the two of us.
Yeah.
So, that's actually not bad. And that would include, families, it would include kids and all this sort of stuff. That's what per capita GDP includes. So, that's actually not that bad. That's almost like, to me, first world. The definition I use for first world might be over 20,000. And it doesn't matter if they're west, east, south, north, or whatever. And that includes some oil states, actually, from the Middle East. If they make over $20,000 per year per capita, well, I don't care. I'm not looking to, they're poor or unfortunate because they're people of color. They're Caucasoid in the Middle East. Come on, wake up. So if they've got some of those places got per capita GDP that's higher than Canada, higher than the United States. So maybe not higher than the United States, but around Canada. So there we go. At any rate, Vietnam lost. So newsflash: the United States beat a strategic retreat. But I've read what Dean Rusk, who's the Secretary of State in 1962, wrote about what was going to have to happen in Vietnam. And he said, we can't win there. We literally can't win. Because if we start winning, the Chinese will do what they did in Korea and come storming over the border, and then we'll have basically a world war. The Americans did an amazingly good job in Korea after the Chinese got involved of stabilizing the situation and leaving it as it was before the North Koreans started doing their nutty business, and when the Chinese invaded. And it was an invasion. They'd almost flushed the United Nations troops out. So they didn't want a world war that involved China, and so they were very, 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 very patient. Here's what Dean Rusk says. He says basically Mao Zedong is crazy. And here's the deal. The CIA had a report that was finally declassified on Khrushchev. And they classified Khrushchev, this way back when, as being hypomanic. So that's low-level bipolar. If that were disinformation, it would have been out, not secret stuff, and it would have been something like, well, he's bipolar. He's like he's way off the beam, being bipolar. Yeah, that was a pretty fair assessment, I think, of Khrushchev. He's bipolar and or hypomanic. Now, here's Khrushchev on Mao Zedong. This happened many times. When I first read it, I thought it was just once, but it happened many times. I won't overstate it. We'll say several times. Mao Zedong to Khrushchev. The way Khrushchev reported it the first time was there. Mao was out there swimming, showing he's like he's showing up Khrushchev, because all Khrushchev could do was wait. And Mao gets to the edge of the pool or something like that, says, "Hey, let's start World War III." And Khrushchev's response was the only appropriate response. "What? Are you crazy?" And of course Mao says, "No." Well, that's not a very good assessment. "No, we'll win." Well, yeah, the no was stupid, and the we'll win was stupid too, because everyone would lose. And at that point in time, actually, here's what one Russian general's assessment of what would happen even in the Bay of Pigs or the Cuban Missile Crisis, which might have been later than Mao suggesting starting World War III, to Khrushchev. He said, before we got, if the Americans had decided to launch, we would have been, before we'd be able to launch our stuff, we would have been grease spots on the wall. So there's no guarantee that the United States, the American military, actually some of them wanted to start World War III over something like the Bay of Pigs or the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Kennedy actually stood them down, or stood up to them. But many of them thought that they'd actually win, and I think they were a little bit closer to being on beam than Mao Zedong. So Dean Rusk, I think, got it right, and I think Khrushchev, if he were still alive, would agree with Dean Rusk. Mao Zedong was crazy, and the Americans, at least the Kennedy administration, didn't want a war with China. And so here's what Dean Rusk says: is we've got to just tough it on out until Mao Zedong dies. And the Americans, I guess they kind of failed in the mission, because they basically kept the commies from taking over all of Vietnam until 1975, and they failed by 1 year. Mao Zedong died the next year. So the important thing is, and this guy makes fun of the domino theory. We don't know whether the domino theory worked or not. My suspicion is that it actually was it worked for World War II. So Vietnam was kind of a key to the Japanese taking over Indonesia, which was what they wanted. They wanted oil from Indonesia. I can guarantee you the communists wanted oil from Indonesia too. And the Americans managed to slow down the communist movement into that area. So my suspicion is the communists had this idea. Well, the way they do it is so-called insurgency. It's not insurgency. It's a surreptitious invasion. The commies were using Laos and Cambodia to send stuff into to the commies in South Vietnam. So they basically did an invasion of Laos and Cambodia, and then they were supplying that way. That's what they would have done going into Thailand and Malaya and stuff like that. They would say, like, we're doing nothing. Yeah, right. That's the way they operated. At least the Maoist types. The Soviet types tended to encourage a revolution inside urban areas, and then by a broad spectrum of left-wingers, and then what they do is they'd have a coup and overthrow that. That's what they did in Russia originally, and they did that in a few other places. They were trying it in Greece, for example, right after, or even before World War II ended, possibly, but right at the end of World War II. So this idea that the Americans lost in Vietnam is they retreated. They didn't really lose a war. It was part of a much larger war there. So you know, you'll get a lot of fake left-winger triumphalism about, you know, like the Vietnamese beat the Americans. The Americans, you know, like that was just a retreat. It's nothing to get all head up about. And the Vietnamese actually lost. They were a battlefield for two sides that were much bigger than them, and they lost a lot of people. There was a lot of environmental damage and stuff like that. There were a lot of war crimes being carried on both sides. The people, however, started to understand this is Lenin's formula, and this is a repeated sort of thing. This is there can be no. Well, the translation might be bad, but I don't know. I think the word is revolutionary terrorism. We're going to do revolutionary terrorism. It's important that the Soviet Union, I think China was involved in it too. We're trying to get at war crimes being defined as not applying to, this is very in the code, we're not applying to so-called freedom movements yeah, that's their freedom movements, freedom fighters, communist freedom fighters, anarchist freedom fighters, Trotskyite freedom fighters, Maoist freedom fighters. They fight. They're freedom fighters in the same way that firefighters are firefighters. Firefighters fight fire. Maoist, Trotskyite, anarchist, Leninist, Stalinist freedom fighters fight freedom. They don't fight for it, they fight against it. Sad to say. And so the big problem with allowing them to do war crimes and not threaten them with prosecution for war crimes is there will be a lot of people who will be fighting for independence or freedom and stuff like that, and the communists end up crushing them either before the stuff gets successful or after independence is achieved. So that's what happened in. You had some freedom fighters in the Soviet Union or in Russia in 1917. They got some freedom. They were going to have an election, and before the election happened, the Soviets had to have their, well, it wasn't really the Soviets, it was the communist Bolsheviks, had their little coup, and they called that a revolution, but it was really a coup. And so they were actively fighting. The others were fighting for freedom. They were going to have an election. The communists were fighting against it. So I wish people would get that clear, you know, like fake left-wingers out there. There is a difference. Well, and many of the fake left-wingers out there are communists and anarchists and Trotskyites and yeah, I once made the joke. I was asking a guy, an expert in the Soviet Union, what do you call a follower of Trotsky? What's the correct term? Is it Trotskyite, Trotskyist, or terrorist? And he had a bit of a chuckle about that. I don't know which part of the left-wing spectrum. He said really we tend to use Trotskyite in English, but he said the actual term in Russian is Trotskyist. But I'd still maintain the best designation is terrorist. But terrorite. Oh, let me see. There was maybe one other place where I kind of had a little. Now understand, this is highly recommended. It's just the history. He's going with the more or less received opinions, and they're kind of some of the stuff. It does not really conform to something that we might call reality. Copeland, I think, was a communist sympathizer. He talks about him being a communist thing, about him being a populist. Maybe he was a little bit of both. I don't know. I got to read up on Copeland.
So what I'm doing is planting grape seeds.
This is impressive. Eh? So yeah, collected a lot of grapes.
Tub full of, I'm trying grape seeds different ways to see which germinate best. And I left this one out to experience a winter stratification period out in this tub over November and December, and then in January here it warmed up a bit, and I planted a few, but then I I'm really bad at doing things lately. I get down and then I stop doing everything. And, well, no, I start eating a lot of chocolate. That's what I do. So, but I think I might be stopping the bad food habits now. We'll see. I'll let you know. Keep you posted. But it's got to stop because I'm feeling terrible.
Yeah, it's bothering me. Anyway, yeah, it's a very good series. You know, like some of the stuff I went through twice.
Yeah. But we have to return it, so.
Yep.
Now you can borrow it.
There we go. See, I don't know how many of these things exist in all of Alberta. This might be the only copy. Where did this come from?
I don't know.
Edmonton Public Libraries. It might be good.
Most of the stuff that I get comes from Edmonton. But not all of it.
Yeah, I just can't see there only being one copy. I mean, Calgary should have one. These great courses, they should be all available at the Lethbridge Library. I mean, we're over 100,000 people are around there.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's
Same
funny.
thing in Red Deer. It's 100,000 people.
I overheard somebody complaining once because they found some great courses that were on the library book sale and they're brand new, right? So when you donate things to the library, make sure that it's a library that's actually going to put the stuff on the shelf rather than just sell it so that they can buy like popular fiction or some crap.
Maybe even unpopular fiction. I
Yeah,
don't know.
who knows?
People actually gets this stuff out.
So I found that the Claresholm Public Library, they carry great courses. So they're just a tiny little place.
Yeah.
But if you want...
I don't think it's even 5,000 people. You know, we've got 20 times the population, and we're having to borrow from. Wow.
Yeah, but if you want it to be a part of your library system, don't necessarily donate it to the city that you live in. Donate the stuff to
Edmonton Library, whatever.
little communities.
Or
that,
little one.
Yeah, little communities that might actually put it on their shelves rather than just put it in a library sale and sell it off for $1 when you went and paid $350 for a course or whatever. So some of them, yeah.
Wow.
So that people can actually learn something and enjoy.
Well, you can actually enjoy and learn off of these things.
Yes, you can.
Because
Definitely
most of the lecturers are very entertaining.
Yes.
You know, some of them are actually riveting. Right?
Yes.
So, yeah, I don't know if you told me that. I think you worried I was going to get a little bit depressed.
Well, at first when I started borrowing them, I was a little bit worried about you touching them, honestly. Because I was thinking, oh God, are we going to have to pay for these things? Because James loses the book or whatever, right?
No.
But it hasn't happened, so I'm not worried anymore.
I'm absent-minded with the chemo I take, though. Try to keep them in the same place all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know me. I always do. I'm just that way. You know, like I've had people tell me, say like there was one woman that the gates were left open when I was working in Grand Prairie, and they were. She said, "Well, could you lock them up when you're through? Some of them are left open." And I'm like, "Yeah, well, if they were open when I got there, I left them open, right? Because I don't know if somebody's going through or what's going on with that, you know." Like,
Yep. Yeah, it's funny
Right.
when people assume